In August of 2003, a rather disturbing blog began in the Washington, D.C. area and ended abruptly in December of that same year. The blogger's name was Eric Nedney, and he lived in Tenleytown, a few metro stops north of the center of the city. He was a 27-year-old political science student at American University when he submitted his first blog entry, telling his anonymous readers that he had just recently stopped his once-weekly practice of astral projection because he had begun to feel physically quite strange after his 2-hour sessions. He was experiencing a sense of great pressure in his chest, which tended to bring him back from wherever his spirit self had gone. He had been waking up in his off-campus apartment with that inexplicable pressure and was worried about his health. This was in early August. Unfortunately, Nedney did not go into very deep detail about the methods of his astral projection practices, writing only that he had been experimenting with them since late in high school as a method of stress relief. A couple of days after Nedney swore off astral projection for a while, he blogged about seeing odd faces in public, on street corners and in cafes, and once at a DC United soccer game at RFK Stadium. The faces and the people who possessed them, he said, seemed normal enough until they turned slightly, at which point he could see that the people's eyes had been drawn down severely, as if artificially stretched. The first time he saw this, he was alarmed and figured he had simply seen an unfortunately deformed person. But when he saw 2 more people like this, he knew something was wrong with him. One day, the very religious Nedney saw such a face standing just 5 feet from him at a bus stop, and he made an appointment later with a priest, whom he called Father Brand. After a long talk with Father Brand, the priest advised Nedney to give up astral projection permanently because it could be a damaging thing to the spirit. Nevertheless, Nedney tried it once more that very night to try to calm himself, but he was never able to achieve the highest stage of projection necessary to leave his body. On the brink of achieving it, he began to hear low, sinister voices, whispering things he could not understand. He remembered hearing the phrases severed tongue, angel shriek, and cross him out and kill him. When he fully regained consciousness, he felt tremendous pressure on his chest, as if someone or some object were literally lying on top of him. He cried out, and suddenly the weight was gone. Over the next several blog entries, Nedney described his struggles to maintain his graduate studies in political science while in the throes of some sort of mental illness. He wrote that he'd begun to have bizarre ideas in the middle of conversations, saying things that made sense to him but not to others. His speech became littered with tree and forest imagery for no reason, to the point where people would stop and ask if he were all right. Then, one night he sat down to write a letter to a friend. But the letter came out almost illegible, and what could be read had almost no relation to what he had been trying to say. Finally, in early September, Nedney began to feel that invisible pressure on top of him in the middle of the night, but completely independent of any activities involving astral projection. This is a quote from the blog. "I wake up and I thrash around trying to get the thing off me, whatever it is. When I stand up, the weight disappears, so now I'm afraid to go to sleep at night. I'm taking some sleeping pills, over-the-counter stuff, which worked really well in the beginning, but I've already gotten a tolerance of them. I feel the weight on me one night out of every 3 or so. A dream of his father caused Nedney even more serious distress. In the dream, he remembered the day when, during a divorce battle, the man had abducted a 6-year-old Nedney and his brother from their mother's custody, luring them from their backyard. After a terrifying high-speed chase in which a pedestrian was seriously injured, his father was arrested and Nedney never saw him again. The man was killed by a freight train a year later in Rockville, having parked his car across the tracks in a fit of depression. In Nedney's dream of September 2003, his father broke out of jail on the night of the abduction and came back, wearing a tattered black robe, and demanded that his children come to him in the name of the Crawling One. The day after suffering this dream, Nedney saw another person in possession of the strange face with the damaged, mutated eyes again, this time in church. A normal man sitting in front of the pew had transmogrified into a deformed one. Returning home, Nedney felt flu-like symptoms coming on. Severely weakened, he passed out on his bathroom floor, and upon waking, he decided to go to the hospital, where he explained his symptoms of the past weeks to a doctor and underwent a CAT scan. At this point, Nedney had been blogging for 2 months, and the consensus seems to be that the diary became more and more fractured, the entries shorter and not as thoroughly proofread. The day after the CAT scan, Nedney was sitting in the park at McPherson Square when a man sat down next to him. Turning, Nedney almost screamed when he saw that it was his father, who had been dead for 20 years. I couldn't even speak. I was shaking. Dad said hello in a really hoarse voice, and he asked me if I could do him a favor, which was to go to Gaithersburg and get his car from an impound lot. And I knew right away that he was talking about the car he died in. It was totally crushed when the train hit it. Then he said something even weirder. He invited me to a festival in Fort Dalton Park, where all the imps and changelings would gather that night to sort out their work for the Dark One, before all patience was lost. I swear he said this to me. I could even smell the alcohol on his breath. I closed my eyes and put my head in my hands, but he didn't go away for another 5 minutes. Finally, he was gone. I couldn't stop trembling.
When Nedney awoke the next morning, he found several pages of text in his own handwriting laid out on the foot of his bed. The writing was cramped and extremely difficult to read, but it seemed he had written an account of an experience with astral projection of the night before as it was happening, even though he'd had no intention of projecting and hadn't tried it for over a month. He had written of soaring above a vast forest, then walking through it as a fog gathered around him. When he looked closely at the trees, he saw that many of their branches were in fact human arms, hanging down, their flesh gray with rot. As he began to run through the forest, many of the arms dropped into his path, spattering his ankles with blood. Nedney spoke again with Father Brand after that. The priest asked to read his dream journals, which documented the experiments with astral projection from their beginnings several years before. When he was through, he set up an appointment with a psychiatrist for Nedney, and at the same time asked him to come back to him every other day to update him on his illness. He seemed very concerned with some of Nedney's projection experiences, especially his occasional fragmentary conversations with an old man he called Horatio, who existed only as a spirit in the netherworld of Nedney's dreams. Writes Nedney, "It's tough to describe Horatio.
When we talk, it's usually about paganism, and we're always in the desert somewhere, but it's cold and the sky is dark. Horatio is almost 100 years old, judging by his face, but he's really muscular, and when he talks, he darts about a lot in a very athletic way. He is always incredibly intense. He says Christianity is a perversion, and he makes a lot of interesting points, but he makes references to books and studies that don't even exist.
As Nedney's blog entered November, he had been given a number of medications to control his hallucinations. His CAT scan had come back negative. He feared he was going totally insane, and one night he consciously returned to astral projection to achieve some sort of peace. He wanted to see his father's grave, which he only dimly remembered. He felt his spirit leave his body after several hours and go there, taking in every detail of Mount Olivet Cemetery. At one point, he turned and saw his old spirit friend Horatio sitting in the grass near the grave, and the two of them began to speak. This time, Nedney was frightened to hear Horatio mention a festival to be held the next night, right out in the ocean. He invited Nedney to come, where there was a chance, Horatio explained, that they would both be crowned as kings, and would enable them to move on to a spiritual level far greater than anyone could imagine. Even disembodied, supposedly safe from harm, Nedney felt a great fear at these words and walked away from Horatio, who warned him that with every step he took away from the coronation, Nedney's father would get closer and closer, waiting in the trees with as many arms as you ever saw. There was a 6 or 7 day gap in Nedney's blog. His next entry was by far his longest. In it he described a conversation he had with Father Brand and a friend whom the priest had brought with him, Father Plessy. Based on all that Brand had told him, it was Father Plessy's belief that Nedney had become possessed by a demon. Which one would be impossible to discover except through the process of exorcism. Astral projection, he explained, was a very dangerous practice to those with buried psychological problems, because the spirit and the body could become too far divided, with either one susceptible to profound weakness. In that state, possession could occur if the person projecting was not guarded against such a thing. Horatio was a demon, Plessy believed, who had used the ghost of Nedney's father in a sick game to try to get Nedney to commit to the coronation, full acceptance of a demonic possession. The more fearful Nedney became, the more likely it was that he would accept Horatio's offers to give him an escape. Each festival Nedney allowed himself to witness would entrench Horatio deeper and deeper into his mind and soul. Nedney heard both priests out and found that Brand trusted Plessy with his diagnosis. They wanted to begin an exorcism right away. Nedney accepted. His next-to-last blog entry went into some detail about what the process would be like. It might take weeks, he wrote, and he would have a few hours each day of total consciousness as the men paused from their work on him. Plessy had performed 6 exorcisms in his life. He had been very honest about the fact that 2 of them had failed, but never told Nedney what exactly that meant. Plessy wanted to involve 2 other priests in the process. Nedney's final blog entry apparently consisted entirely of this single paragraph. I'm sitting on the floor of the church now as I type. It's 6:15 and dark and snowing. Mr. Hillish is starting the preparations for the exorcism.
I need to eat something because I'm weak, but I don't want to ask him for anything. I'm saying now, for anyone who will listen, that I am frightened of Mr. Hillish. When he was standing near the window at sunset, he turned when a car alarm went off over near Arena Stage, and his eyes were suddenly stretched low on his face. He was deformed. It went away within a second, but I know what I saw. When he's in the church with me, I get an awful feeling. It's like being in a room with some lifeless thing pretending to be a human being. I don't know how else to phrase it. The others don't know him well enough to judge his character, but I believe in my heart that he is here to do me harm. I don't know why he would, but the feeling is overwhelming. It seems that he wants to see the exorcism fail. I sense that he's not truly human. Father Brand says I'm in a terrible state and that it's natural to be suspicious of everyone, but my perceptions have been distorted and can't be trusted. I think he's the one being deceived. All I can do is trust that he knows what he's doing and that he knows Mr. Hillish more deeply than I. But I'm so scared. I want to tell them I can't do this, but I don't think I have a choice anymore.
Eric Nedley's blog was removed from the web 4 days before the beginning of his exorcism, by whom is not known. At 11:33 p.m. on January 6, 2004, 9 days after Eric Nedley's finally blog entry was posted, a man by the same name, 27 years old, a former graduate student at American University, was admitted to D.C. General Hospital, dropped off at the curb by a person or persons unknown. He walked into the emergency room and collapsed. A priest who did not give his name came just 1 hour later to ask about his condition. When he was told that Nedney was in intensive care, he said he would return. Nedney died less than 48 hours after his admittance. The official cause of death was listed as dehydration caused by severe pneumonia. The mysterious priest, described as tall, bearded, and in his 40s, never returned.